Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to our public briefing on ethnic studies. I'm Elisa Finston, the Senior Vice President of Community Engagement for the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. I am thrilled to be here today representing the Jewish Federation in this important conversation. We are also thrilled to have over 400 people on this Zoom with us today, and we expect a few more to join us, to hear critical information about an incredibly important topic of ethnic studies. We are also thrilled that today's program is the result of a partnership with numerous Jewish organizations across California. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the San Francisco-based Jewish Community Relations Council, the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles, JPAC, the Jewish Public Affairs Committee of California, the San Francisco-based Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund, the JCRC of Jewish Silicon Valley, Stand With Us, Jemena, Progressive Zionists of California, the Jewish Federation of Orange County, the Oshman Family JCC, the Jewish Federation of Greater Santa Barbara, the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, Jewish Long Beach, the Jewish Federation of the Sacramento region, the Jewish Federation of Ventura County, Jewish Family and Children's Services, the Jewish Federation of Greater San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys, and the Sacramento-based JCRC. That's a total of 19 organizations. And each of these organizations that I just named has been involved in advocacy on ethnic studies for the last 18 months. And each of us have been working very hard. Our advocacy has included action alerts to encourage all of you to send public comments to the Department of Education, and meetings in person and on Zoom with different Department of Education officials and our various legislators. And while each of our organizations are unique in our missions, we have all taken slightly different approaches in this advocacy, we are all seeking the same outcome, that the ethnic studies curriculum does not discriminate Jews and represents all Jewish Americans. We know that in Los Angeles, while our Jewish community is very politically diverse and has multiple lenses on this curriculum, we ultimately have the same outcome. In today's conversation, we will learn about how we got here today, what has been the timeline and major developments of the curriculum, including the current status of ethnic studies, the advocacy strategies I mentioned, how we all work together even though we have slightly different organizational missions, and what is next for the curriculum and our work together as a Jewish community. We will also touch upon some of the recent articles we have all seen about the curriculum and clarify the misinformation that was in many of the articles. During today's conversation, I encourage you to put questions for the panelists in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we are so very pleased to have with us today the chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus, Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel, who's also a former board member of the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles and an alum of our signature civic leadership program, the Rautenberg New Leaders Project. Assemblymember Gabriel represents the 45th Assembly District in the West San Fernando Valley. We have been so fortunate to work with the caucus and the Assembly member on multiple issues impacting the Jewish community, which you will hear about more in today's conversation. The caucus's leadership on this curriculum has been impactful, and Assemblymember Gabriel has been a leader in this work. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ty Gregory, Executive Director of the San Francisco-based JCRC, who will join Assemblymember Gabriel in conversation. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy today's presentation.
Thanks so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Clearly, there's a lot of interest statewide in this emerging issue for our community. We're so grateful to have all of you joining us. As you can see, we have an intense and a broad coalition of organizations that have co-sponsored this. It took a full minute and a half to get through them. And I just want to reflect on that for a moment, because this has been a collaborative, ongoing effort for 18 months. And we are in one sense at the finish line statewide, but in many ways, this story is just unfolding. And so it's with that in mind that we really want to take you a little bit behind the scenes. And we thought no better person to help us do that than Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel. Assemblymember Gabriel represents the 45th Assembly District, which is in the West San Fernando Valley. And Assemblymember Gabriel, welcome.
Thanks, Ty. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you. So I know that as a father of young kids and as someone that's lived in Israel, you have a long history of activism in the Jewish community. We've joked about some of our shared training over the years, and this is deeply personal for you. And I know it's something you care about as a state legislator who is elected to represent 500,000 people in the San Fernando Valley and serve Californians of all backgrounds. So we're going to dig into a conversation together now, and we encourage folks along the way to please type in your questions in the Q&A. We got over 500 people. We're not going to get to them all, but our team's going to aggregate them, and I'll ask your questions after our formal back and forth. So you were recently elected as the chair of the Jewish Legislative Caucus. So before we dig into the issue of ethnic studies, what is the Jewish Caucus, and what are some of the issues you've been focused on collectively in the legislature, and what are your priorities in this new session?
Yeah, thank you, Ty. I'm delighted to speak about the Jewish Caucus, and really glad to be here. And first, let me just say thank you to you, to my good friend Elisa Finston, who I've had the chance to work with, and to just the incredible constellation of Jewish community organizations that are hosting this program. And it's such a privilege as chair of the caucus to get to work with all of you, and kol hakavod to all of you for not only for your advocacy, but for getting in the boat and rowing in the same direction. I know that's not always easy in the Jewish world, and I have the easy job, I joke, in Sacramento, of trying to get 18 hyper political, hyper opinionated Jews on the same page as chair of the Jewish Caucus. So I have a lot of newfound respect for every synagogue board president and every CEO of major Jewish organizations. I know that we have lots of opinions, and it's hard to get everyone on the same page. So the caucus is relatively new. We have, there are a number of identity caucuses in the state legislature. In California, we have the Black Caucus, the Latino Caucus, the API Caucus, the LGBTQ Caucus, and the Women's Caucus. And a few years ago, some folks, before I got to the legislature, organized the Jewish Caucus. And really, we have a couple of missions that we work on. First is to be our community's voice in Sacramento. And so we work on what we call consensus community priorities. So those are issues of hate crimes and anti-Semitism, community security, Holocaust education, the California-Israel relationship, things that are really central to our community and our interests in the state of California. We also have very recently started working on what we call our Tikkun Olam agenda. So for the past 2 years, we have picked bills that maybe don't always particularly or only relate to the Jewish community, but speak to our values and are often priority bills for those caucuses that we work closely with. And so we try to do some work on things like poverty or foster youth or other issues that we think really speak to our Jewish values. And then the other part of our work is really to help our colleagues understand a little bit about the Jewish community. I, as you heard, represent the West San Fernando Valley, so you can go to Valley Beth Shalom, where I go to synagogue, and drive down Ventura Boulevard past Mitzvah Land and go eat lunch at Tel Aviv Grill. And most people in my community are friends with Jews, and they know a lot about our community. But what I've discovered in my 2.5 years in the legislature is there are many of my colleagues in public service who don't know much about our community. They don't have a lot of Jews in their community. And so we have tried to help folks understand some of the history of our community, understand our community's interests and desires. We did some really good work on that front about 1.5 years ago when we took 19 legislators to Israel to help them understand a little bit about what's going on there, to help them understand our Jewish community a little bit better. We try to do things to sensitize my colleagues to holidays, our history, our tradition. I haven't shared it with them yet, but all of my colleagues, when they go to session tomorrow in either the Senate or the Assembly, will get mishloach manot. We're going to give them some hamantashen for Purim with a little note about the holiday and what that means to us. And then the other way we do our work is in the budget. So we fight really hard for the Jewish community's priorities in the budget. We've been able to secure money for community institutions like the LA Museum of the Holocaust, the Simon Wiesenthal Center. We're able to put money in the budget for security grants to help Jewish institutions and also LGBTQ community centers and mosques and churches who are at risk of hate-motivated violence, and to do that kind of work as well. So, this session, I think hate crimes and anti-Semitism will be at the very top of our agenda. We're going to hopefully going to work very closely with the API community. As you know, in San Francisco, there's just been a wave of really unfortunate and scary violence against our Asian American community. And so we're going to work with them to try to move the ball on hate crimes and to protect all of our vulnerable communities in the state of California.
That's beautiful. And I think that you've underscored something really critical, which is that the Jewish Caucus and all of our Jewish organizations, we can't only be focused on Jewish-centric issues to solve Jewish problems, both because we have Jewish community members who are also represented by these other caucuses, and because in order to really root out anti-Semitism, sometimes anti-Semitism in of itself is a symptom of a larger problem in our societies. And for us to uproot those racial and economic inequities and protect our democracy, these things that you're all doing together, these things protect Jews too. And we commend you for those things.
I agree with that very strongly. And I'll add one other thing, which is I think they're deeply consistent with our Jewish values. I think that fighting things like racism and bigotry are there's a lot of, go read Abraham Joshua Heschel or read Rabbi Sachs, and you'll understand how deeply intrinsic, working on issues like poverty or homelessness are to us as Jews. So we consider our work really to focus both on issues that are specific to our community, like anti-Semitism, but also to do this broader work that affects all of us as Californians. And we see that as really consistent with our Jewish values.
Amen. And I think that that's a good light post for us to keep in mind as we dive into the rest of this conversation. So as underscored by the attendance today, this issue has received national attention in recent weeks, and along with it, a lot of confusion and concern. I think what set this off a few weeks ago was a tablet article last month with an inflammatory headline, "California is cleansing Jews from history." So it would be great to start with an overview. Can we get a big sense of the picture today in a context for this conversation? What are some things from your perspective that you think everyone should know as a baseline?
Yeah, look, as somebody who's been pretty engaged in this since 2019, since the middle of 2019, when our Jewish caucus first became aware of this issue and got involved in a pretty forceful way, I'll say that the tablet article really missed the mark. And there was a lot of context lacking, and there's some facts that are just wrong. And it really isn't accurate as to the current state of play. And I think that's unfortunate because it really frightened a lot of people in our community. And there are things that we need to be aware of and be vigilant of, and there is a lot of reason for concern about things that have happened. But the tablet article is just wasn't accurate. And so, from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of the Jewish caucus, here's where things stand, and we can talk more about it as we go through. We had a deeply problematic first draft that had inappropriate anti-Israel content. It had anti-Semitic content. It had really just incredibly offensive things. I mean, read these song lyrics about how Jews control and manipulate the media. I mean, stuff that was just absolutely unacceptable in any shape or form. And that provoked a very strong and swift reaction from the Jewish caucus and from a lot of Jewish community organizations that became aware of this. And you've seen all of the 18 or 19 organizations that are at the table today doing this work. And since then, there have been significant improvements. Now, there's more work to be done. The curriculum is not finalized, but we have really, really moved the ball on a lot of fronts and made some really good progress. The curriculum has gone through multiple rounds of revision. And so we're hopefully going to get to a good place with this curriculum. Now, as you mentioned, Ty, and what's really important is that this is the end of the beginning in some ways. Right? This is the end of this model curriculum, but we know that this is an issue that's going to pop up at local school boards and in other places. And so our community has to continue to stay vigilant and be engaged. But from the big picture perspective, we have made a lot of progress that people should feel really good about. A couple other things that I want to just mention, and Elisa, I think, alluded to this in her introductory comments. This is a deeply complicated issue. And there's a lot of room for nuance and principled disagreement and slight differences of opinion in the Jewish community. And I'm sure that, if all 546 of us got together around a Shabbat dinner table, I could probably find 700 different opinions on exactly how we should do ethnic studies. This is complicated stuff. And so, we have tried to find where is the consensus community priorities here? Where do the overwhelming majority of our community sit? And I think just given the broad distribution of organizations you have at the table, we've been able to figure out where the majority of our community is. The other thing I just want to add here so people are aware, the legislature is not writing this curriculum. This curriculum is being written by folks at the California Department of Education. So we as legislators, we don't get to write any curriculum. I don't write the math curriculum. I don't write the history curriculum. I don't write the ethnic studies curriculum. All of that's probably a good thing, especially the math curriculum. But we are trying as best as we can to be deeply engaged in the process and to work with community organizations, with the governor's office and with the superintendent of public instruction to help shape this.
That's an important distinction to note. I just want to again share with everybody that there is a Q&A function. I see folks putting them in the chat. We are encouraging you to please continue to ask your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom right of your screen, and we'll ask those questions towards the end of the program. So you talked a little bit about the different drafts, and let's zoom in on the current draft, which came out in November, and we're now sort of in a lull between the third draft, the public comment period that we all rallied around, and the final product that we'll see between the March 5th and 8th. So what is the product that we're seeing now in the curriculum, the third draft? And what are some of the improvements that you mentioned that folks should know about?
Yeah, and so let me, again, I think I'm just seeing some of the comments that are coming through in the chat here. And so let me maybe add a little bit of context here that might be helpful for folks. So there are multiple efforts around ethnic studies happening at multiple levels. So you have what we're mostly talking about today is a model curriculum for school districts to use in high school. And so this is something that is required by a bill that passed the legislature and was signed into law in 2016, before I was a member of the legislature, that requires the Department of Education to create a model curriculum. There are also efforts to have ethnic studies at the Cal State University system, where it will now be a graduation requirement. People are talking about having it at community colleges. We've talked a little bit about how there may be a fight at local school boards, but what we're really talking about today is this model curriculum that school districts could use to teach ethnic studies in high school. And you know, as I mentioned, there was this initial draft of the curriculum that came out. It came out in 2019. It was sort of, you know, was crafted by a very small group of people with I think some really problematic views. And it was during the period when there was a transition to a new superintendent of public instruction, a new governor. And when it came out, it really faced widespread criticism. It wasn't just from the Jewish community. The LA Times editorial board, which is a pretty left-leaning editorial board, really slammed the curriculum. There were folks who are big champions of ethnic studies in the legislature that criticized the curriculum. We had the governor, even though he had nothing to do with writing it, personally apologized for it and promised that this curriculum would never see the light of day. And so we were able to sort of you know, push pause on that process and work to get this process restarted. There were new people that were added to the committee that oversees the curriculum, including one of my colleagues, Ben Allen, who's former chair of the Jewish Caucus, and Dr. Anita Friedman, who's a great Jewish community leader in San Francisco. And a lot of progress was made. And so a couple of things happened. One is that the denigrating content about Jews, the stuff about BDS as a social justice movement, about Jews as manipulating the media, all of that was removed. We also advocated for, our community successfully advocated for, to put in lesson plans about the American Jewish experience. And we now have not one, but two lesson plans about that, including a lesson plan, and really kol hakavod to the Mizrahi Jewish community and folks at Jemena who organized to put in a lesson plan there to help folks understand the full diversity of our Jewish community here in the state of California. It's a good lesson plan that has, you know, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and some other really important things. And then there were changes made more broadly to the curriculum to make it more about students doing their own thinking and not about just accepting sort of dogma from three people who happen to be involved in writing the first draft. And so, again, there are still things that people are trying to tweak, still some edits that people would like, and we'll see where things land you know, next month when the Board of Education is required to make final changes and improve the curriculum. But I think we've made a lot of progress. And one of the validators for me about how much this curriculum has changed is that some of the folks who had really problematic views, who were involved in writing that first draft, have now demanded that their names be taken off the curriculum. They no longer want to be associated with this curriculum. I guess it doesn't, you know, it doesn't have the edge on it and the discriminatory content against Jews on it that they would like. And so they would no longer like to be associated with this curriculum. So that to me is a one marker for how much the curriculum has changed from that first really problematic draft.
Definitely, and it definitely refutes the Tablet article when the people that did seek our exclusion from history resigned, which is something important to keep in mind. So shifting gears just a little bit, you know, I personally have been working in the LGBT movement before coming into this, and there's been spaces where I was asked to check my affinity for Israel or my Jewish identity at the door to be a part of an LGBT organization or event. And that felt terrible, but that didn't change my belief in LGBT rights or gay marriage. And there's kind of an element to this same progressive arena, this civil rights arena that we're dealing with, around public education. And the founder of the ethnic studies movements were communities of color who felt like ethnic studies was righting a wrong. And so how do we bring our uncomfortable truths around our discomfort with some of the way that this has gone with our main allies in these communities of color, notably the Black, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, and Native American communities? And I would love for your response, in your capacity in the legislature, dealing and engaging with the ethnic caucuses that are also very interested in this fight. So can you walk us through a little bit about how you're navigating that and working with your colleagues?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ty, and a really important thing for folks to understand. And I am very privileged in my role as chair of the Jewish Caucus to get to work really closely with the leadership of the Black Caucus, the Latino Caucus, API, Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, the other diversity caucuses. And those are really important relationships for us for a variety of reasons. And I guess the first thing I would say is, one, it's really impossible for me to overstate how important this issue is to them. They view ethnic studies as an extension of civil rights, as fundamental to racial justice. They want their community's stories to be told. They want young people in their community to learn about the history of bigotry and discrimination that their communities have faced. And it was interesting to me, we had a resolution last week on the spike in anti-Asian American hate crimes that we've seen. And two of the speakers, so a member of the Latino Caucus and also a member of the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, brought up ethnic studies as one of the responses to fighting bigotry, to teach people about the Chinese Exclusion Act and about the history of discrimination that Asian Americans have faced. And these are not people who, I know both of them, neither of these are people that harbor ill will towards the Jewish community. They are not people who are particularly extreme in any of their views, but for their communities, this is really important. And part of the issue here is there's not really a consensus among a lot of folks about what the boundaries of ethnic studies are, or what should be included in ethnic studies. And there are sort of different versions of it. And the original draft was from a small number of people that have a hard ideological version. They will have a narrow political perspective. And they basically want to use ethnic studies as a vehicle to advance that narrow political perspective. But for the overwhelming majority, maybe all of my colleagues in Sacramento, for them, ethnic studies is not that. And that doesn't mean that doesn't get into complicated issues and force people to think and force people to think about uncomfortable periods in American history and prejudice and racism. And we think that's important, but we think that it's really important that we respect that and we honor that. And there's I think there's a strong argument that as Jews, we should be allies of theirs in that, in working with them to fight bigotry and discrimination, as I mentioned before. And so, I think it's just important that we keep in context when we're doing this. It's really hard oftentimes for a lot of our colleagues, my colleagues in these other caucuses, to understand why Jews would be opposed to ethnic studies, right? It's like civil rights, how could you be opposed to it? And so we've had to sensitize them to some of these issues, really help them to understand why we have concerns about certain parts of the curriculum. And these are sometimes tough conversations, but they're important conversations. And I think when we have them, as they've come to understand our community's perspective, that has been very, very helpful. And that they have understood that we want to go in a direction, and there's a way to create ethnic studies that is not this hard ideological version, but is a version that can really work for 95% of California, hopefully 95+% of California. That honors the origins of ethnic studies and the difficult conversations it's supposed to raise, but certainly doesn't have bigotry or discrimination in there that is simply unacceptable.
Amen. I think one way that I've talked about it with folks who are very new to this issue is who are the folks that wrote the history books in our country for hundreds and hundreds of years? Who wrote the social studies, curriculum that our students were learning in classroom? My guess is they looked closer to you and I than women of color. And I think that giving the communities the opportunity to write their own stories, their own history, their own culture, they deserve the ability to tell their own narratives in our classrooms. I think our responsibility is to make sure that it's something that is going to be received well by students, and in particular for us Jewish students, right? but there's a principle that we can relate to because Jewish identity is so often flattened in the public arena in this country, in the state, and we still have some work to do explaining the richness of Jewish diversity and experience based on where people are from in the world, based on religious affiliation, cultural, et cetera. So that, that's something I think that we can really relate to as a community.
100%. And I've had these really great conversations with one of my colleagues, James Ramos. He's the first Native American to serve in the California legislature. He was elected 2 years ago, shortly after I was. And he has this very warm affinity to our Jewish caucus because he sees us, like the Native American community, as people who have experienced genocide. And that this is this instant bond between our communities. And he's always wanting to get together and talk about it and think about how we could work on genocide education and other things that are so important. But for him, the history that we've learned in public schools in California has too often glossed over the fact that we had state-sponsored, in certain occasions, genocide against Native populations here. I think back, I was in 4th grade and I built the mission in Red Island to the Blue Dolphin, but, there wasn't an exploration of some of the more challenging parts of our history with our Native American populations. And so for him, ethnic studies is a no-brainer. Of course, we need to teach young people these things. Native American history has not been accurately taught, and that's important for him. And it's not, again, this is somebody who I think has incredibly warm feelings towards the Jewish community, but would like his community's story accurately reflected in the history books as well.
Definitely. We got a question from the audience that I think dovetails nicely into this, and that is, when you're talking with your colleagues in these other caucuses, how do they feel about the issue of Jewish inclusion in ethnic studies? What do you sort of share from all of us collectively, the Jewish lens, to sort of explain how we're feeling about this issue?
It's complicated. And I will say that there is not, just as there's not a diversity or a unanimity within the Jewish community, there's not unanimity within these other communities, and not within the Black community, and not necessarily between the Black caucus and the Latino caucus. There are differences of opinion in all these communities and among different activists and other folks. So look, I will say our approach in doing this as the Jewish caucus has been sort of threefold. One is to make sure first priority is to get the bad stuff out, firm red lines that there are no content that is either anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, or could be perceived as that. And that was a firm commitment we secured from the superintendent of public instruction very early on in this. Two was to integrate information and lesson plans about the Jewish American experience, as you've discussed, in its full diversity. Because unfortunately, you and I don't represent the full diversity of the American Jewish community, not even close to it. And I know that because I represent a district with a beautiful Mizrahi population, and Israeli Americans and Persian Jews, and all of the different shapes and sizes and colors that our Jewish community comes in. So getting that information about the Jewish experience in was important to us, and we had to have a lot of conversations with folks in some of the ethnic caucuses who, for them, maybe at first didn't really understand why that fit. Now, by the way, that wasn't just an issue for the Jewish community. Persians and Sikhs and Armenians and Koreans and so many other communities around the state who found themselves excluded from the first version also came to the legislature and more directly to the Department of Education and said, we would like to see our history reflected in this. We would like to see our story told in ethnic studies. And part of the direction that Governor Newsom provided was that we need a curriculum that reflects the beautiful diversity of California, that our diversity is something that we celebrate, and all of these, there's a way to weave in all of these stories. And so that has been something we worked on. The third really important pillar of our approach is, how do we do this in a way that enhances rather than diminishes our relationships with these other communities? And I will say, that's really important to us. One, because we think the majority of the Jewish community supports ethnic studies. And as I talked about before, the ADL was involved in some of these efforts early on because they see ethnic studies as a really good way to fight bigotry and discrimination and hate crimes. Two, it's consistent with our values and our history of fighting racism and bigotry. And three, because it's deeply important to our relationships with those other communities who, by the way, have been really good allies to us on some important stuff. I will say for me, one of the most meaningful days of my service in the legislature was 2 days after that terrible shooting at the Chabad in Poway. It was a Monday, the legislature was in session. It happened to be that we were going to do a ceremony for Yom HaShoah on that day. And it was 2 days after that shooting. And so I scheduled a press conference with some of my colleagues, and we were calling on the governor to fund the security grant program that I had authored a bill to create to help protect our community. And the leadership of every single one of those other caucuses came and stood with us and said, we support the Jewish community. The Jewish community is facing hate-motivated violence. We're seeing it in Pittsburgh and in Poway and in Charlottesville. And we are also calling on the governor to fund this program and protect our Jewish community. So there are really important reasons for us, not just because of our values, but also to be aligned with these communities. These are valuable relationships to us and mean a lot to our community as we think about issues that are important to us.
So you gave a great of inter-community relations. Let's talk about intra-community relations and look inside of our own tent, where you can find plenty of diversity of experience and opinion on this issue as well. And we've developed a great partnership as a constellation of organizations with you and your colleagues. How have you approached the big tent of the Jewish community on this issue? How do you think about the constellation of Jewish organizations that have been fighting alongside you?
Well, so first thing I want to do is just applaud all of you. Your engagement and your advocacy and the action alerts and the time and attention that you've brought to read through the curriculum and weigh in and attend meetings and advocate for our community. I mean, to me, one of the saddest parts of the tablet articles, it missed all of that. There's been extraordinary activity by the organized Jewish community in the state of California to work, to be at the table, to engage productively, to meet with the superintendent, folks in the governor's office, with legislators, with really important advocacy. And I want to just say, Ty, to you and all of the folks who organize this, go vote. You guys have done important work, and your advocacy matters. Look, as I said before, as Elisa said, there's not unanimity of opinion on this. There was diversity of opinions in our community from the very beginning, and part of what we did is just try to do a lot of listening. That's part of what I try to do in politics and as chair of the caucus. And at the beginning, my head was spinning. I'd take a call from someone who I deeply respect, who's a longtime leader in the Jewish community, and they say, we should do X on ethnic studies, and this is what we should push for. And 2 hours later, I'd have a call with someone else who is an equally, firm leader in our community and well-respected, and they would have maybe a slightly or very different take on what we should do. And I think over time, the community really coalesced, and there was broad agreement, and that's why you see all of these organizations, this array of organizations that I think are largely in the same place right now. And what we have tried to do as the Jewish Caucus is to just amplify the community's voice, right? We've talked about this issue directly with the governor on multiple occasions, with his senior staff, with the state superintendent, with our colleagues in the legislature, just to tell them, help them understand, one, what our community's concerns are, and then to advocate for changes that we think will benefit our community and also all students in the state of California. So, it's not, as well know, it's not, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and that multiplies over time as you get more folks at the table. But I do think that the community's done a really nice job, and folks are largely in the same boat and rowing in the same direction, and I think that's really helpful.
Thank you for that commercial. Last question for me, and then we're going to go to to some of the questions from our guests. So we're nearing the finish line here. We're going to see the final curriculum. We'll do a fine-tooth comb review of the curriculum to make sure it's kosher by our community standards. And then it goes to the state school board for an up or down vote. So that's all going to happen within the next month. But we've hinted that this is a years-long fight, and that's because it moves to the district level with school boards determining how to adopt a curriculum. How should all of us watching, how should Jewish organizations, and how do you think you and your colleagues are going to stay engaged in this effort as we switch to the district level implementation?
Well, it's going to be it's going to require sustained engagement and focus from our community. The one helpful thing that the tablet article did is it really, alerted people to the fact that this is an issue that we need to be vigilant around. And we are going to see people, some of those folks who wrote the initial draft of the curriculum, they're already starting to do it. They're going to try to go school district by school district and school board member by school board member and try to get individual districts to adapt this, a highly problematic version of ethnic studies with this initial discriminatory and bigoted content. and we're going to have to be there to push back. But I think a lot of it is just explaining things to people, right? I mean, for a lot of, and I've had this experience when I've talked to some local school board members, people come to them and they say, ethnic, we should do ethnic studies. And people say, post 2020 and Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and everything we've seen with demands for ending systemic racism and racial justice, that's a no-brainer, especially for our colleagues who are come from communities of color and where this resonates with them immediately. And so we just have to do some education. We have to do some explaining. We have to say, yes, we in the Jewish community support ethnic studies. We believe that fighting bigotry and racism and discrimination is deeply consistent with who we are, and we want to be your allies in that. But we also can't have content that is promoting discrimination and bigotry against Jews at the same time. And I think people get that right away, but a lot of it is just getting engaged and explaining that to people, and helping them to see the nuance and the details, because people are busy. These school board members are busy, as they're trying to get schools back open and deal with COVID and all of the millions of other things that they have to do. And so I think everyone on this call and all the organizations need to be alert and engaged and aware, and you should watch what's going on at your local school boards. And I think a lot of this will happen at some of the bigger districts in the state first, so we can expect that. And we as a community are going to have to do what we do. We're going to have to come together and participate in the democratic process and lobby our elected officials and the decision makers. And I think we'll ultimately be successful because the truth is on our side. We are absolutely fighting a righteous fight here. And I think it's really hard for the other side to argue, no, we really need some bigoted, discriminatory content about Jews in ethnic studies. That's a hard position to maintain. Now, they do some interesting mental gymnastics to explain why they want that. But I think these are fights that we can and we will win.
And I think that the general public would agree with our position on these issues. I think this is an anecdote not directly related to ethnic studies, but we saw what happened with the San Francisco Board of Education when they tried to rename 44 schools, including Dianne Feinstein Elementary School in San Francisco. The parents reached out to us at JCRC, said, what is this? So we mobilized. Unfortunately, the parents' testimonies didn't work, but then the outrage around how ridiculous this was, especially since schools can't open, snowballed. And eventually they said, oh, wait a second, maybe we're out of touch with reality here. We're going to put a pause on this. So we know when our community speaks up, when there's injustices around issues around education, we do the relationship building, we do the advocacy, we can prevail. And I think that that's a really important lesson moving into this district level stuff.
100%. And the only thing I would add is that we have natural allies and partners in this work. And that's basically other communities that want their story told. That's people who want content and for their kids that is not extreme, that is not focused on a narrow political agenda. They want their kids to learn to do critical thinking, and people who don't want discrimination and bigotry in the classroom. And I think that's most of California. And so sometimes, as you know, our community we got to be first up and we got to mobilize. But there are a lot of natural allies that we have in this work, and I think most people in the state of California would agree very strongly with the perspective that we have about how you can do ethnic studies, but do it in a way where you do it right.
Agreed. So let's move to some of the questions we have, and just want to put one final point on what you said, and that is that we're unlikely to get a perfect final draft. This isn't a curriculum that you or I would have written verbatim for what we're likely to get at the end. But I want to highlight something you said, and that is that the alternative to an imperfect draft that we can live with isn't a perfect draft. It's the first draft that the BDS movement and people who don't like what we're doing are trying to shop around district by district. And so if we have a much stronger starting point where we have lessons on the Jewish American experience and where anti-Semitism is removed, that's going to make all of our district level efforts as organizations from JCRC here in San Francisco, all the way down to our friends in San Diego and everywhere in between, that's going to make our efforts and all of your engagement in this process for years to come so much better. And that's how we're thinking about it.
That is exactly right, Ty. I don't know what a perfect draft of this curriculum work like. As I mentioned, I could probably grab 3 rabbis at random from my community and invite them over for Shabbat dinner, and we could go through the curriculum, and I'm sure that they would come out in different places on it. This is nuanced, complicated stuff, and I think what we're looking for is what are those top line things that are really important to our community, and where can we make a big difference on the issues that really matter.
Definitely. So the first question from the audience is related to something that you've raised throughout this process, which is ensuring guardrails, ensuring that in the actual implementation in the classroom of this stuff, that there are some ways in which people are going to have to adhere to the curriculum and to prevent this curriculum from being, manipulated to achieve certain ideological outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about what that means, how you thought about that, both legislatively and perhaps beyond that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, there are already guardrails in the California Education Code, right? I mean, you're not supposed to teach things in a way that promote bigotry or bias in the classroom that make students, feel like they're being targeted. So a lot of this already exists in the Education Code. We felt that it was important to re-emphasize that. And then so in working with our colleagues in the legislature who've been advancing legislation around ethnic studies, we have suggested to them guardrails that they have adopted and accepted as an important thing to put a box around this, right? That you don't want something that is directly or indirectly going to promote bias against anybody. That's an obvious thing. It's hard to be on the other side of that. And the Department of Education actually looked at some of what we had proposed in the legislature and actually took it and is, as I understand now, baked into the actual model curriculum. And I think that there's going to be continued work in the legislature to do that, to draw that sort of broad box that, again, probably already exists in state law, just to really provide direction to local school districts that says, look, and again, it's almost sad that you have to say it. There are boundaries here in how you teach this, right? And to teach something that is going to promote discrimination against Israelis based on their national origin, it's going to promote discrimination against Jews based on their religion, or anything else is just simply inappropriate. And I think that direction is going to go a long way. And frankly, look, if there's a school board out there that does something crazy, they're going to get sued, or they're going to have the Department of Education come in and crack the whip on them because they're going to be in violation of state law for doing what they're doing. And I think that's a really helpful. Those guardrails are really helpful, and they're going to keep us on the right track.
And we and our colleagues as organizations plan on doing that oversight work, making sure that as school boards adopt ethnic studies, that happens, and as it's taught, that it's done appropriately. And that's why it's so important that you as constituents of school board members stay engaged in this process. As you know, as an elected officials want to hear from their constituents most of all. And that's why it's so important we continue this engagement.
Except for maybe the members of the San Francisco School Board. I'm not sure they want to hear from their constituents right now.
Right, they don't want to hear from me in particular, but that's okay. So we had another great question, and that is, has there been dialogue with the Arab American community about their own concerns and their own desired outcomes regarding the curriculum? We have sometimes conflicting viewpoints, not on everything. There's so much that we share, but how do we build trust and understanding between our communities when it comes to ethnic studies?
It's a great question, and I have talked to some of my colleagues that have raised this issue. We've talked about how do you do this in a way that is inclusive. I mean, we in the Jewish Caucus have tried to build bridges with and really with the Muslim community. I mean, there are no Muslim members of the legislature, and so we've had some conversations with folks in the Muslim American community about some of their issues where we have broad alignment with them. I mean, we have really fought with them on security funding. On issues related to discrimination, where we have a really strong alignment. We work to try to help them get a prayer space at LAX. So issues of religious freedom that are important to both communities. So we have always viewed this as an opportunity to work with folks, to learn, to listen. Now, interestingly, I don't even know. Some of the folks that are pushing the really offensive content are people who see the Middle East differently than us, but a lot of those folks are not, necessarily Arab or Muslim or part of those communities. They're people that just don't understand the Middle East, right? And they're people that have a bias against Jews, and so sometimes we actually have better jumping off points for dialogue with our friends in some of these other communities than we do with people who just have no idea and can tell you the difference between Ramallah and Ramat Aviv. But are somehow convinced that Jews are the source of the world's problems, and those are the people that we have issues with.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think one reason we've been particularly effective in the curriculum is that we have adhered to the fact that this is a domestic discipline. This is not a foreign policy course. This is not an international history course. This is not a complexity of the Middle East course. This is about the domestic experience. And so when we've engaged and we focused on Jewish-related issues, sure, Israeli Americans are immigrants, but so are Egyptian Jews, and so are Jews from the other around the world, Ethiopian Jews. And by talking about the American Jewish experience, I think we've been very effective in getting those lesson plans in that came from our community. Our friends that have focused on the BDS movement and tried to politicize this, they have not been adhering to the spirit of this curriculum, which is in fact about Americans.
Correct. That's exactly right.
So I know that we've had a number of people jump on since the beginning of the program. So we're just going to give you a 30-second review of where we are in the timeline. And then I want to turn to you to talk about the legislative track to this because we didn't really touch on that as much. So the first draft came out about 18 months ago. It had denigrating content about Jews, Judaism, and Israel. We mobilized. The second draft removed those things, but it expanded to include some new communities, but not Jews. We mobilized again, and now it includes Jews, Sikhs, Armenians, and Arab Americans in this expanded curriculum. There's no denigrating content. That's the state of the third draft. There's still some minor issues. Our community is working to tighten the screws, and we're awaiting the final draft in a couple weeks. At the same time, the curriculum is in development. There's been work in the legislature all along to introduce ethnic studies, the idea to want to mandate ethnic studies. So can you give us just a little bit of the history of how this evolved in the legislature, starting with your friend Luisa Alejo, and sort of walk us up to where the conversation is amongst your colleagues today?
Yeah, and I've actually never had the pleasure of meeting Luis Alejo, as far as I know. But he was the author of a bill that I mentioned that was signed into law by Jerry Brown in 2016 to mandate a model curriculum. And this is often how things happen in Sacramento in the public policy arena. They happen in steps. And so, a lot of what we've been talking about today, really most of what we've been talking about today, is the development of a model curriculum for school districts that want to teach ethnic studies. And surprisingly, I think the last statistic I saw, there's already something like 25% of school districts in the state require ethnic studies. So there's already a lot of folks out there doing it. Parenthetically, they've been teaching ethnic studies in parts of LAUSD, I think, since 2014. Now, they're not teaching an objectionable version of it. So most people probably didn't even know that because it hasn't made headlines, because it's good curriculum that people feel good about, and that fairly and accurately represents all communities. So there, when the Board of Education approves this curriculum in March, you will have a model curriculum that school districts can draw from. Now, as a practical matter, that's really important because a lot of districts are going to borrow from that model curriculum, probably entirely, because it's complicated to write curriculum. Textbooks will likely be written to, the example of the model curriculum. This is complicated stuff. They're going to have to train their teachers, and relying on the materials from the Department of Education will be enormously helpful to them in that. There are efforts at the legislature to make ethnic studies a graduation requirement in high school. And there was a bill last year that worked its way through the legislature and made it to the governor's desk that the governor ultimately vetoed. And his veto message was, I think ethnic studies is great, but we don't have a good curriculum yet. And go back and fix the model curriculum. And this is where he put in his veto message, as I mentioned, a lot of language about we celebrate our diversity, and we need, I'm instructing my staff to work with the Department of Education and to work with the state board to really fix this and to get a good curriculum. And so that bill has been reintroduced. It's a very important priority for our friends in these other ethnic caucuses to make ethnic studies a high school graduation requirement. It has also been made a graduation requirement at the Cal State University system. And I just found out there's another bill to make it to mandate it at community colleges. And so I just had the author of that bill reach out to me to talk to me about that and try to get my thoughts on that. So again, a lot of activity. This is again, I couldn't overstate how important this is for a lot of our colleagues in the legislature. They really see this as a fundamental, important part of their work. And by the way, it's something that has really broad bipartisan support. You had multiple Republicans, including some of our most conservative Republicans, vote last year to make ethnic studies a high school graduation requirement. So in some corners, this notion of ethnic studies may be deeply controversial, but I think in the California legislature, among both Democrats and Republicans, there's a lot of energy behind it, and a lot of folks who believe that it's time to include this in our curriculum.
Definitely, and I'm sure we have people outside of California watching. The reality is this is something that is going to impact the whole country, I think. At least in blue states and major cities across the country, we see this coming. We're already sharing best practices and lessons learned with our colleagues in different parts of the country and doing briefings for the community relations field on our lessons learned. So for those of you watching outside of California, this is not a conversation just about us. This is something to start engage with proactively, build the relationships with the Department of Education, start meeting school board members. We really have to begin the work early because this is a major priority for communities of color, and we want to be on the right side of history for them and for ourselves. Last question, there's a lot of interest in Holocaust education, which really isn't related directly to this issue, but is obviously an important priority for our community. Can you just talk about that generally, what the state of that is, if there's any activity in the legislature, and how you and the Jewish Legislative Caucus are thinking about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Deeply important issue to a lot of us. I have a lot of my colleagues in the legislature, some who are the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, others who are, have Holocaust survivors in their extended family. Many of us lost a lot of family in the Shoah, and really worried by the lack of awareness, particularly among young people, about the Holocaust. And we read the same disturbing reports that you do about how many millennials don't know how many people were killed in the Holocaust, don't know what Auschwitz is, aren't sure what the Holocaust is. And so we feel a real responsibility to try to remedy that. There are already, baked into state laws some requirements around Holocaust education. And so what we've tried to do is think about ways to put money and energy and effort behind that to make sure that it's really being taught. And so we're going to work on some proposals. We actually just had a Jewish caucus. It just so happened today we had our monthly Jewish caucus meeting. We talked about the fact that that's going to be a major priority for us. The other thing that we've tried to do is support the community organizations that do great work about this. So 2 years ago in the budget, we secured $6 million to build out the LA Museum of the Holocaust. They do incredible work with tens of thousands of students in Southern California, many of whom have never met Jews, who know very little about the Holocaust, who come to the museum, who can meet Holocaust survivors, who can learn. It's a very powerful and impactful experience for them. The museum was small. It could only accommodate, it was built for a smaller number of folks, and it couldn't accommodate all of the demand. And so we secured funding to help them expand their work. We're trying to do similar things with some of the other institutions around the state that do Holocaust education. So this is an important priority for us, and we are really committed to again strengthening those requirements that are there in state law, and more importantly, making sure that they're adequately funded and that students in our schools are learning about the Holocaust.
As a millennial, I do love my avocado toast, but you're right that too many of us are missing the boat on that one.
I'm an elder millennial. I just don't have the same fashion sense that you do. So much cooler than I am. So how do we stay engaged with this? How should people, on this webinar, stay engaged with this fight in the months and years ahead? Well, it's first of all, I hope that all of the organizations here that have been sending action alerts will continue to do that and to keep people engaged. And I know that my inbox has filled up many times over the past year, from whether it's my dear friends at the LA Federation, where I used to be a board member, or Stand With Us, or JCRC, or others. People are sending out the IAC. We've got a ton of emails from them. Please call into the state board. Please, register your opinion. I think at one point, and I don't want to get this wrong, but I think there were like 30,000 comments from the California Jewish community that were submitted to the state board at one point about this. So the notion in the tablet article that people, weren't paying attention and weren't engaged. I mean, I think the most comments that the state board received were from the Jewish community, and many of them coming from action alerts from organizations that, synagogues, that we had some rabbis and communities where a lot of folks weighed in that wrote beautiful letters that I read from various rabbis around the state, people who wrote op-eds. So, I'm really hoping that our community institutions can do a lot of that work and keep people updated. And as those of you that do this work professionally, and certainly we will stay engaged and try to help spread the word where we can. But those of you that have big email lists and help people stay informed. And again, I just I think you should also be really discerning in what you read about this. The tablet article was making a point, and it was making an ideological point about identity politics and other things, and that's fine, and that's what that kind of opinion journalism is supposed to do. But it's important to get the facts right? And they quoted from a letter, a really strongly worded letter that the Jewish Caucus wrote, that I wrote in 2019. They just didn't mention anything that happened since then. And so that, I understand why that frightened people, but I would really encourage you to, really make sure that you understand, what the sources of your information are, and check in with people and check in with folks who, Jewish community leaders across the political spectrum that have been engaged on that. And that actually is one of the coolest things about this. At a moment in history when we are so deeply divided by politics, there has been a lot of work by people who may not agree on a lot of other issues to come together around this. And I really applaud, the leadership in various Jewish organizations up and down the state, because people have put aside their disagreements on other things and said, we're going to work together on this to make sure we get it right for our community, because it's really important.
Assemblyman, thank you so much. Our organizations hope to do you proud, and I can't speak for everybody, but I speak for JCRC when I say how important it is for us all to move forward united on this issue. The people that would like to exclude us would love to see nothing more than for us to fight amongst ourselves. And I think at the end of the day, what you've laid out for us in our 30,000-foot goals, that's something we can all rally behind. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ty. I want to express my thanks to you personally, to JCRC, to Elisa and the Federation, the whole range of Jewish community organizations that have engaged in this fight. On behalf of our community, I'm grateful for all of you who do this work professionally. It's a real mitzvah, and we're not gonna let ourselves be excluded. That's not an outcome that's gonna happen here, and we're not gonna let people teach anti-Semitic stereotypes to our kids. As a father, kids in public schools in the state of California, we're not gonna let that happen. And I think that when we work together, when we raise our voices together, we're gonna get good outcomes. So I'm grateful for your advocacy, and I just wish everybody a happy early Purim, Chag Sameach, and I hope you all stay safe.
Thank you. To close this out, I'd love to introduce my colleague and partner in crime, Danny Grossman, who's the CEO of the San Francisco-based Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund. Danny, take it away.
Ty, thanks so much. It's great to be here this evening with all of you and to have heard both of you in conversation. So let me start by also thanking you, Assemblymember Gabriel. We are so appreciative for not just that you joined us today, but really the work you do every day on behalf of the state of California, of course, your district, and the Jewish community. I think even someone who had no idea of you before this webinar and checked in is now very clear on why we're so fortunate that you're in Sacramento. Ty, I want to thank you, you and the JCRC. It's a privilege to be in partnership with you and the work that you do. And of course, the other sponsors of this event, not just for sponsoring this event, but again, for coming together as a coalition at a really critical time with all the nuance and the challenges that Assemblymember Gabriel referenced. We need to sustain this coalition, as Ty said, if we want to make sure that we have a fair, balanced, and effective ethnic studies curriculum at the end of this. Our organizations will be communicating out next steps in March after the release of the draft, as Ty indicated. That's it for today. Please stay safe. And again, thank you all for joining.